Hi, everyone. My name is Olamide. I'm a system architect with EBSCO, and I'm here to talk about enhanced consortial support and what it is and just a high-level functionality of what it does.
Hold the microphone, please.
All right. Problem statement. So, how to offer independence to member libraries while allowing them to target areas where they want to share resources and minimize costs. So, in a consortium, member libraries, some things you want to keep to yourself, other things you want to share to reduce costs. So what is Folio's? Yes, it's enhanced consortial support, not extended. So that's been going around for a bit. So just want to clarify that. It involves cross-tenancy and shadow users. So don't worry about these terms. I'm going to go deeper into each as we go, but listed them out. Authentication and affiliation switching, instance sharing, multi-institution search, and shared settings. All right, cross-tenancy and shadow. So Folio is multi-tenant with strong isolation between the tenants. But because of the problem statement I mentioned earlier, we need to force some level of collaboration and have that working for ECS. ECS adds additional tenant, the central tenant. This tenant is going to come up a lot. It's used for administrative purposes and coordination. And in ECS, a user's relationship to a particular tenant is called an affiliation. So let's say your administrator creates a user for you to a particular tenant that is known as an affiliation. The particular tenant where your user resides is called a primary affiliation. So there are going to be generally two kinds of affiliations, and it will make sense as we talk about it some more. So your home tenant is where your user lives with your credentials and your information. But with ECS, we're allowing creation of shadow users in other tenants within a Folio system, and you'll be able to proxy to those other users in those other tenants. The sharing tenants retains control of the data. So I'm a user here, and I'm trying to get into another tenant over there. The administrator or just that tenant still holds control over the data that we want to get access. So on the back end, like I mentioned, I'm a user in tenant A. That is my primary affiliation. I have shadow users in tenant B, C, or D. Those are non-primary affiliations, and those are shadow users. The common link between them is they share the same identifier, and that's how we're able to say, this is my shadow user, or that is another person's shadow user. Each shadow user has distinct permissions. So I could be a reference librarian in my library, but then be an archivist in another library, while I'm able to switch between whatever tenants have been given access to. So how do you give access? That's by assigning an affiliation to a real user in another tenant. So to kick off that process, the real user in tenant A my mouse room? All right. At the bottom there, we granted an affiliation to tenant B, and that will enable the creation of the shadow user in tenant B. Authentication and affiliation switching. So all users authenticate against their primary affiliation, aka their home tenants. That's where your credentials live. The shadow users do not have credentials, so you can't log in directly into them. So you log in, and then you're able to switch affiliation with the drop down. You see here, you click switch affiliation, and then you have a drop down to be able to switch between the tenants that you have. And when, for example, Northwest Missouri, you have a different permissions. and with State Technical College in other positions. And it's all driven from the central tenants. We log in through the central tenant, and a bunch of changes we made for the CS will allow that to log in appropriately. Lots of extensions were done to the existing Folio authentication and authorization mechanisms. It's the deepest part of Folio we had to change while building the rest of ECS on top of existing Folio. So on the back end, how do you do that? On the right here, I have the endpoint to log in. This will be going to the central tenant. You pass in a username and password. You get a token. The token you get nowadays with Folio, but now with that token, you're able to target different tenants by the use of this header right here. So, exocopy tenants. So you log into one tenant, and you can use that token to access other tenants if you have an affiliation to those tenants. Also, Edge API keys, they would map to specific users, and they too can allow targeting to different tenants. So imagine I have a consortium with 10 users that have an API key. That API key can access all the tenants that the backend user can have. And also usernames are unique across the consortium. Today, it's only unique within one tenant, but with changes we made, it's unique across the consortium. Instance sharing. So we are allowing sharing of inventory instances between members of the consortium. There's generally two flows. One is promoting a local instance to a shared instance. So what is a local instance? A local instance is an instance that belongs to a particular tenant, and that is not accessible by anyone else. But users in the inventory app will have access to be able to promote a local instance to a shared instance. And what that means is that instance is going to migrate from your tenant to the central tenant that I mentioned is for administrative and coordination purposes. Additionally, we're propagating shadow instances of a shared instance. So what does that mean? So you have a local instance, you promoted it to a shared. Now, we need a representation of that instance in the different tenants that are in the consortium. So what we do is we take almost like a replica and duplicate that across the tenants in the consortium. That is done not to break the inventory hierarchy as it exists today. We don't want have to make more changes or break integrations that exist there. And when those shadow instances exist in a member library, you can have holdings and items underneath those and move forward. The member tenant has full control over the holdings, but the shared instance that lives in the central tenants is guarded by users who have access to the central tenant. Here's a diagram trying to represent that. So you have a local instance in your tenant A, and you click a button to promote this. So that will get the instance to the central tenant. And as well, we transform this to a shadow instance because you relinquish control of that instance to be shared across the consortium. So the identifier for these three items are all going to be the same. And consequently, you can get a shadow instance into other tenants of the consortium, and you can see that the source is equal to consortium mark, while the source is marked in the central tenants. And you can go into details there if desired. But with this scheme, this is how a shared instance is available to all the tenants in the consortium. What else? And changes to the shared instance is synchronized to the shadow instances where where they exist. Multi-institution search. So we have shared instances, local instances, all across the consortium. We needed a searching capability across the entire consortium. We want to find out which library has holdings on a particular shared item, or you want to be scoped to your particular tenant. So that is going to be available with ECS. Right now, it's only limited to inventory search, and that's because the searching across tenants in the consortium is backed by OpenSearch. So our UIs that still use the database for searching things orders wouldn't have that capability, at least not yet. And there are two facets that are introduced. One is shared, which is yes or no. So if shared was yes in here, I would only see the shared instances, which are the instances that live in the central tenant. I could select no and not have shared instances, so only local instances will be available. And when you don't have any traits, both would show up. And also, held by is updated a little bit. So now we need to include holdings that exist in other tenants besides the current tenants that exist, and that's why in the screenshot here we have holdings which are the holdings under this shared instance, and then consortial holdings that would exist in other tenants, where you have a summary view of sorts to see that. And how is it done? In OpenSearch, we are maintaining a single index for the consortium. So prior to ECS, each tenant has their own index with their own data, but now we have a single index with updates to inventory being routed to that single index. And the index is only available on the central tenant. So that means any search that needs to happen needs to go through the central tenant. The indexes are disabled for the other tenants that exist in the consortium. Inventory updates are propagated via Kafka and then stored in a staging area, and that's because prior to ECS, any change you make to an instance, the holdings beneath that, or any items, the entire object is rebuilt in OpenSearch. So now that the scope has been extended past more than one tenant, we needed a staging area to gather those objects and then be able to rebuild them as fast as possible. Shared settings. There's a new app called the Consortium Manager. Limited settings for now, only what's most useful, and that is supposed to help with administration across the consortium. Generally, we're working with a higher order number of tenants, so we needed ways to allow easier administration for manipulating settings across consortium. Think I want to create a setting for 15 tenants or 100 tenants, whatever the administrator wants to perform. There's a new setting source value called Consortium. That just means if I'm in my member library, I see a setting and the source is Consortium, it means it's been delivered from up above, in the central tenant. It also allows comparison of permission sets. So I mentioned a shadow user can have different permissions across different tenants. So these views allow easier comparison or setting of permission sets with tenants within the consortium. So with this view too, you can assign permissions to users in any tenant. So think shadow a real user, you can assign different permissions without actually logging out, logging in, or even switching affiliation. So this is a special app that lives only in the central tenant and nowhere else, just due to how powerful it is. There's to propagate all the settings across the consortium, there's a published coordinator that is backed by Consortia, a backend module that is responsible for a lot of the synchronization and coordination of the features that have been mentioned so far. So with the published coordinator, you can target multiple tenants with the same payload. So that's how we get to say, I want to share this setting across the consortium, and I want to unshare them. And then other features in the Folio UI are enabled by the UI being able to target different tenants. So there's a lot of, how would I say, niceties in the UI that will prevent needing to log into every tenant, and that's because with one token, we can get data from multiple tenants and display that as necessary, and all still having the appropriate authorization on each object. Hosting is here, so what does it mean? Right now, a single UI bundle is needed on the central tenant. So if you have 62 tenants, you don't need to build 62 UI bundles, just one. And with that one, you're able to switch applications across the consortium. Because ECS is built on top of Folio, you can actually still log in directly to the home tenant with the appropriate settings, and all that would work. So there could be potential to say, I have a consortium and I want regions and I want to have different branding photos, and be able to accomplish something like that. But still, a single UI bundle is needed on the central tenant. Searching is only available there. Open Search Index is for the central tenants only. It would be a bigger index generally, but only one is going to be available. And then critical dependence on Kafka installation. So all the synchronization that is happening in the background, a lot of it is handled by Kafka. So Kafka installation with a single broker is probably not going to cut it for a production instance. So that would need to be reasonably, highly available for the load that is needed. Tenants are still created by or copy as normal, and then calls are made to Consortia to add them to the consortium and create a bunch of objects in the background. This has been streamlined enough for even the ops team to just create the tenants like they do today, and then add the tenants to the consortium. And Consortia handles all the background in there. So the tenants still have separate database schemas on the database, so there isn't any aggregation going on. So we still need a separate database schema for each tenant as well as for the central tenant. So in the case of MOBIUS, if you have 61 member libraries, you have 61 database schemas plus the central tenant. So putting it all together, how does it look? Consortia, as I mentioned, is a backend module that is responsible for a lot of these changes. It's optional. And then a front-end module, UI Consortia settings, that's mostly what you see as the Consortia manager. And a bunch of enhancements have been made in other modules to make them consortium aware. So when there are actions or processes in any particular tenant, there's usually a question, hey, am I in a tenant? Am I in a consortium? Depending on what the answer to that question is, there can be different flows to what is needed. So whether that's mod search, taking instance updates to put in the staging area, or inventory, trying to create shadow instances and the like. So in the diagram I have here, with everything set up, John Doe is able to log into the central tenant and that login is delegated to member library A, where the real user is. There are shadow users in central tenants, member library C, member library B. Any search that needs to happen goes to the central tenant, and modification of shared data goes to the central tenant as well. So that's shared instances, or perhaps shared authorities, or some settings data. And with the same session, we could get something from member library C, and that is only possible with the shadow user being present in library C. Or we could put something in member library B, which is done with the help of the shadow user present there. So again, if my shadow user does not have permissions to update an object, that wouldn't work, and the appropriate error messages would be shown. So how does MOBIUS use Folio ECS? First, there's a central office, which generally would be characterized with the central tenant as well. There's desire to have standardized reference data across the consortium while still allowing member libraries to have their reference data as well. And then the central office can be represented with another tenant if local objects are desired. So I'm in the central office. I don't want everything I do to be shared, but I want to have my own space. That too can be possible. Mostly shared instances compared to local instances. This wouldn't always be the case, but for MOBIUS, generally instances are shared, and their member libraries would hang holdings and items on that. And also there's a key integration with OpenRS for direct consortial work. I believe there's been a previous session on that so far. So future states, there are possibilities here. So centralized control, similar to how MOBIUS is planned out, where the central office could manage the users for the smaller libraries that do not have the human resources to perform those duties. Or you could still have independent control in the way of Galileo, where there are independent libraries that have their own resources, but they still want to share some stuff. So that is still possible. Library of Congress will be represented as a consortium. So rather than member libraries having their own tenants, think departments having their own tenants, possibly their own controls. Heterogeneous tenants. So right now, we expect all the tenants to have the same modules. But in the future, it will be possible that specific tenants can have specific modules that we wouldn't want to have available to other tenants in the consortium. That is still up and coming. And then inter-consortium interaction. This is still, quite often we want to know what use cases that will need to be supported for that. But to say consortium A and consortium B to perform some interaction, what does that look like? With the foundation of ECS, it's possible to be able to reach out and perform those controlled interactions going forward. Questions? Yes.
This slide was one of the slides where you're showing the search. This slide where you're showing the search across the various consortia. You showed that there was consortial holdings. Is that always present, or is that enabled only if you're running social mode?
Only in consortium. A lot of the UI features we have are not going to be available if you're not in consortium mode. We've gone to great lengths to take that out. So with the release of ECS, Folio should look the same if you don't have anything to do with a consortium. Definitely there are changes in the backend, but that wouldn't be recommended in the UI.
So I don't know if this may be back, but so when you mentioned this user, so if Folio is this user their entire email address or just on how those users are enabled, or how those users are structured, so there isn't communication possibility.
So you're asking how the user makes you?
Yeah, same thing.
Yes, yes.
Does the Consortium then have to agree upon a way to check those changes?
The system will check, but definitely, if say you want to go by email, should be unique enough if that is used, but if there are other usernames that would be in place, say we have existing users, but some negotiation would need to occur to say J Doe need to be Joseph or John that existed, different tenants. How do you represent them in the consortium? So some negotiation we need to have. Mm-hmm.
For a record, a user make a record shared for local. Is that always a manual decision, or can that be set in the data import so that a given profile will automatically make all records loaded through that shared record?
It's generally manual, but data import into the central tenant would be automatically shared. So the location of the instance would determine whether it is shared or not. So all the tenants are still regular Folio tenants today that could express the same functionality.
So in order for a user to do that, they have to load into the central module, and then that would they have to have permissions on the central module. Okay. I'm also wondering about migration. How upgrade? How would upgrading from one system to another work? Would that be a single action, or would you have to do that separately for each tenant?
Okay, so to still be separately for each tenant, same with a multi-tenant cluster, you would have to do.
So if you've got 63 tenants, you've got to do 63 upgrades.
Yes, you have to do 63 upgrades.
There would have been follow up on the using because in general usually, but those external IDs associated with authentication systems there are identifiers that people don't have choice. It's the idea that their users would be staff users and so they just have people that find out.
Yeah, there's been some discussion on the barcode and the external ID you mentioned. And I think logging in via SSO is one channel that can happen. I'm trying to remember specifically, but we gathered that information together with username and sort of like a general lookup of all the tenants. Something I did mention is that through the login portal, there's an option to pass in a tenant ID. So even with there's an option to pass in a tenant ID, and system users, I don't know if you are aware, these are users that created my modules to perform different duties. They have generally the same username, but they're able to authenticate because they have a tenant ID specified in there. But in terms of the barcode and the external ID, I don't remember explicitly what we do that. Okay.
Maybe those are say something about that, but generally, we talk about patron account, code, right? And we aren't intending to create shadow users for patron user records. So the patron will exist in the same tenant. And you can say, if you are aware of what tenant you want to, it's still used within that. You might spoke within that. That is characteristics because our staff. Right, the shadow, the users with shadows are staff, which also could be, they're also.
But this will be, answer my question for the benefit of people outside of the room, the ideas that about people using this functionality with staff users, and you don't have problems. In the worst case scenario where someone post staff user, they simply have staff account to perform those actions. That personalization.
Can I ask a completely separate question? Awesome. So is the shared instance, local instance functionality coupled with this administration part, or can you be an administrative tenant and not do shared instance local instance?
Yes, you can have a tenant and not want to have anything to do with a shared instance. Without that, we have a search and you have to exclude shared instances from your view.
You have to,
Yes.
we could just have local instances and have no shared instances in your central tenant. Have all your instances down in your member tenants.
Right, but that's not gonna happen, right? I mean, otherwise, what's the point?
Well, yeah, I agree, but
Well, I guess then maybe what was the what's the motivation? What's the original purpose of having shared instances? That your instance installed,
we have having local instances or having shared?
shared.
Shared. So the idea behind having a shared infrastructure is that you can have one, I guess, the data associated with that instance used by all members. So there's one instance that's managed in one place that is considered as, for all intents and purposes, one set of data that each member can attach those names to it. So they can have localized data associated with it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't need it, but. I mean, there is a use case for having only local instance records, and that is, one of our libraries, Consortium Botanical Garden, they use a lot of non-standard subject headings. And so they want to make sure that their bid, bid's only Folio, they want to make sure that their bid records are theirs alone and not used because they're afraid of having non-standard subject headings overwritten by other libraries. And so their entire file will be loaded as local as opposed to shared instance. And they then can promote their local bids to shared, if they, at least on a case by case basis.
I'm curious about that situation where you've got the one library, all local records. Is that library be able to copy from shared records and make them local?
Yes.
Yes, they can. You can take
Like, the short answer is yes. And one thing Greg and I were talking about a minute ago, right now, everybody who is live on Folio is on what we've been calling a non-consortial tenant. You are your own tenant, not in relation to anybody else. And the development team that I work with and that a lot of the architects for is doing the inventory and doing important work to make these shared instances and shadow instances and promote local instances to be shared. And so for all of those scenarios, when we are doing that work, we are trying to make sure that we have clear descriptions of what should happen if I'm a central tenant, or if I'm an instance in a central tenant, what should happen if I'm an instance in a member tenant, what should happen if I'm an instance in a non-consortial tenant. Are there actions I should not see? Are there actions that I should only have an option for shared and not local, or vice versa? And then we're trying to make sure we have tests to cover all three types of tenants so that we don't mess up anybody that's already live, and that we have a really clear understanding of what's happening depending on which of the kinds of tenants your user is working with.
So despite Corey's best effort, I want to take us back to the user authentication piece. I think you said that signing in to Folio gives you a token that is usable at all tenants. If that's true, how does that work?
It's usable for tenants you have an affiliation to.
It's the same
Yes,
token.
the same token.
So there's one token issuer across the entire consortium?
Yes.
Wow, okay. That's kind of, okay.
So, hey, this is I want to have some discussion here. I want this to continue, but I thought what I'm going to talk about is probably just going to lead us right back into this conversation. So maybe it's best that I get started and we get through some of this to help sort of focus this conversation, because this is great reaction. Okay, I'm excited. The couple of things I wanted to talk about, and we only have roughly a half hour, a little over a half hour left. So some of the things that you're asking are things, the exact things I wanted to talk about. So following this kind of technical background, you've had some of the explanation of why we've done certain things. I wanted to then sort of refocus on what I think are some of the core concepts here and talk about where you see value moving forward and have some discussion around this. So repetition is helpful, hopefully for all of you, it is for me. So I wanted to just quickly go through three of these concepts again that you're sort of asking questions about, it turns out. The idea of centralized and distributed administration and how this ECS, this Enhanced Consortium Support, will allow for that. The idea of shared configurations, which are what Olamide was talking about when he mentioned, the ability to create a reference term and settings for all tenants at one time, or to create a reference term that appears in all tenants, which is similar to the concept, technically similar to the concept, I might be butchering this correctly. It's technically similar to the concept that is used for shared records, like shared instances, an instance that you create in a central tenant that appears everywhere and everyone can use, so to speak. To reiterate those things and look at some of the other workflows that we know that they could be applied to, and talk a little bit more about how that might be valuable, or whether, and how much of an impact you think it may have on your consortium. Consortia. I'm also just realizing, as I'm standing here, how tall you are. I can barely see over this. I feel like I wouldn't have even seen it anyway. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So a lot of this was talked about, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I wanted to show, without getting into doing some demo here, a little screen. This is probably way too small for you to even see, isn't it? So let's just go here. So the first thing I wanted to show is this is a test environment that we have, and this concept of creating a reference term. So you're all probably familiar with this area. It looks like the settings app. We've selected users and the departments, which is one of the reference data, one of the parts of reference, bits of reference data you can create in the users app. The idea of centralized versus distributed administration is supported by the consortium manager in this particular way. At the top of the screen, you can see that there it says 3 members. Okay, I'm not even sharing what I think I'm sharing. I do not think you know what that means. I'm looking at something here. Okay, let's do it this way. Better?
Yeah, yeah.
Glad I looked up. So this might be a little clearer. So there's a select members button here at the top of the screen. And in the consortium manager, essentially you're identifying the context in which you want to navigate this particular application. Context being what affiliations, to use the same language, that you want to have as context for your experience of the consortium. So Lamine talked about a user can be affiliated with as many member tenants as you would like to allow. In this example, there are 3 tenants. There's the central one, and there are some other examples. And my particular user is affiliated with all 3. Just to illustrate this concept that you might have an administrator that doesn't have the ability, or that you don't want to have the ability to manage everything. You might only want to allow that user to manage, 2 or a collection, a subset of members, so to speak. So the interface and the technology that Lami has just described will support that. And it looks a little bit like this, in theory, where you're able to see the list of, in this case, reference terms, but you're only seeing the ones that apply to the affiliation that you have, or the affiliations you have selected. So if I were to create a term, for example, here, and this might be a little tricky. There's an important distinction here. I'm going to save this term for all of the libraries. And by doing that, effectively make it a local reference term for all of those members versus a shared term. You can see there's a little button there that says share. That's going to be important later. So here I click save, and it's just going to confirm, be sure you want to create this term for all of these members. So I'm going to do that. And when I explore the list here, you can see that this term now appears here twice. And that's because I have created a local version of that term. And from this point on, those are independent terms that exist in those 2 tenants. Versus, wish I had a sheet. Creating something that is shared. Cross your fingers that this is all going to work. The idea here is, as was described, I am actually going out and creating a term in all tenants, but they have the same unique identifier. And so we represent that in this list. I think you can barely see it. You notice that under the member column, it says all. So it's being consolidated into one term. And the important thing about this, as was mentioned, in the individual tenants, when you go to settings, you will see, for example, test term 1, and be able to edit it if that's your tenant. Versus you will also see this test term 2, but the source will be Consortium, and you won't be able to edit it there. Now, of course, that user could be given permission to do those edits, and we can facilitate that. But the kind of main idea here is that you're able to create a shared reference term. So just to drive that home. So there were kind of 2 concepts there that we went through. The idea that a user can be put into a box to only have access to certain member libraries and still use some of these powerful consortial features to manage those member libraries. Or they could be given all, access to everything and control everything that way. The other thing you can do is create local data quickly for all tenants or for a subset of tenants, or create shared data that can be used by all tenants. Important concept. So that was shared configurations. The last thing that I wanted to kind of reiterate here before we get into discussion is the idea of shared record, which we're all asking some questions about. In the example here, you're seeing a user create an instance inside of a member tenant, like they would in any other Folio situation. But when they're using the action menu, they're clicking create new shared instance. So initially, this is how that distinction will be made. You can create a new shared instance or you can create a new local instance. But you will also be able to convert a local instance to a shared instance. And in doing so, allow me to kind of explain what would happen when you do that. And the important part about what happens when you do that is that that instance becomes a shared record that all libraries will be able to see. So you can't share something to only 5 of the 60, at least not at the moment. The idea here is you're sharing this up to the entire group. And from that point on, in an individual tenant, you're able to attach holdings and items. So from that point on, when we look at that shared thing, we can represent the local data. And we can also basically control, depending on the permissions that your particular user has for those different members, we can limit what you're able to do with that data, whether you're just able to see it, whether you're able to see additional information, like to actually take a look at the full record, or add additional records and associate them with that thing, like if it's holding, whether you can add more item records to it, and so on. So you can see some of the buttons here are grayed out, some of them are active, so to speak, and that's the idea of what we're illustrating there. So I wanted to take a little time, if this might work, and think about applying these concepts in other areas. Some of the use cases that we've seen so far to date that come from Consortia, the Consortia SIG, functionality that was identified long time ago, come from discussions with MOBIUS, relate to what you might see as ultimately applying this concept of sharing to other records in the system. And so there are 4 here that I wanted to sort of highlight, because we know that there will likely be some interest in these areas. Sharing organization records, sharing agreement records, sharing orders, sharing financial records. So it could be a ledger, could be a fund. And in some cases, it seems pretty straightforward that you may want to share the actual thing. And in other cases, it seems like we might need to collect a little bit more information. Organizations, for example, does it make sense to share the entire organization record, or just address information, or contact people, or interfaces, aspects of the organization record? So, in an attempt to have some discussion here, I want to start with the organization record. And I will throw the mic at whoever would like. Maybe not literally throw it, but. So I wanted to present this concept and have some discussion around it and collect some feedback on it. Because we've definitely heard use cases that would argue that it would make sense to have organization records or organization data that is shared by every member of a consortium. Are there folks here who have thoughts about that? Sharing entire organization records versus sharing some of the data associated with an organization.
Yeah, it's your chat. Well, keep an eye on
So, thinking about MOBIUS here, and this could work if just like with inventory, it's a shared record and then it's copied down locally. But for MOBIUS, it's just a large share of unshare database. That's another thing MOBIUS does. So besides hosting iOS and the organization that provides that or that pays for it is MOBIUS, right? And it could be an extra database, it could be a normal database. Correct me if I'm mistaken. But they may want to have their own interface login, something that there's something of their organization, right? And they don't want that to be shared. So I guess this working, you could bring organization, you could clone like organizations that lots of folks have. Stuff, but obviously MOBIUS is a state, they probably have the same contact, not exactly, but they might be some parallel sales people or other contact types that you put in organization directly. That makes sense. That I don't think I get this MOBIUS. So we started thinking about it, so
Yeah.
But in some, you have the ability, someone there may be only one school that has subscription though. And I'm thinking of just looking for training as well. American Physical Society, they're super expensive. So only, local organization. Someone else.
I would think in most cases, it's probably fine to share everything, but there may be niche cases where it's not, where, for the law library at Georgia State may have a different contact, perhaps for a particular organization than the other libraries in the state. Or there may be, a note that an individual library does not want shared, with the other libraries in the state, or that the consortium, that Galileo does not want shared. We've got a contact or a special line of escalation that we don't want to make available to just everybody.
One of the left, there's so little that's necessary to create an organizational data, and most of it is individual needs. Forms, what would you share? Things. So I'm also thinking like, what could be an active vendor for some and not an active vendor for others? What could be a vendor for some and not a vendor for others? I don't know that anybody would want to share their account code, especially if they do that about their output. That would be the private thing to be. So what's the point? The sharing if most of the data is individual for us. Unless the only thing I can think of is looking in my former life. I did used to buy things for more than $100. That would be the only case. But then I would want to share it with a select group of people, not everyone. So you might want to share with the other 5 universities that are super one of these, but that's it. And then there would be some privacy with that, because you usually find privacy.
So sorry, you're saying you might administer the organization data for more than one member?
You could, but you wouldn't want that to be shared with
everyone. Yeah.
So you would potentially want to share with some, but not all. So I don't know an answer. I'm just thinking this You might confuse. What name? I don't know. What's
Yeah.
up?
All feedback is good. So,
Yay, okay.
yeah.
I'm sorry, this is not right to the point, but it's a thing we got mentioned earlier. Sticking in my brain, I kind of think I made it look good. We talked about how we promote local records, the shared records. And we have said today that it's also possible for shared records, for local records. But in prior conversation, prior meeting, it was stated that it's not possible to demote a shared record to a local. So my question is, when we talk about making a shared record a local record, are we talking about deriving a new local record from a shared record? Because it's shared, in the case of inventory records, and there's holdings attached, what happens to belong to other libraries? What happens to those holdings need to move that record?
Yeah, good question.
I mean, yeah, the short answer is yes. That currently
We haven't been planning to allow to demote an instance. That's not to say that it's impossible to do.
It's not impossible in the first iteration.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
we're talking sort of theoretically here, like, technically.
Well, mentioned converting a shared instance to a local instance, it's more like duplicating.
It's
So-
not deriving.
Yes,
Yeah.
so you have a shared instance, and then you can say, I want to upload it to the local. So shared instance is still going to exist. And also, there aren't any holdings directly on the shared instance in the central tenant. It's all in the member average. So if we were to have functionality to demote a shared instance, the instance and the holdings will still within the member average. There's probably some one-off effects that are not. At this time, it's not possible to demote with copy the right.
Thank you. That addresses that equation, my concern.
Once you've derived something though, like you can in inventory now, you can move it forward.
Yes.
No connection back. So if you did derive something, then you could move. If we don't do it automatically, we'd be somewhat doing that automatically, which is not currently planned. Okay, just to come back to organizations. Yeah, I'm gonna keep after this. You're not gonna get me away from it. This exercise is gonna work. I don't care if you want it to or not. I wanted to take by a show of hands, essentially, get a feel for how much of an impact you think this might have. And I'm not translating this into official decision-making or anything, but I thought it would be interesting for everyone in the room to see how people assess how people might assess the impact of having shared organization data. So I'm going to, I know there are users that are online as well. And to not alienate you, I'm going to post the link in the chat, but I'm essentially going to start voting here, and just by show of hands. So the scale here, impact of 1 is very little impact. Impact 5 is a very significant impact. So by show of hands in the room, who here feels that the ability to have shared organization data would have a very low impact, be a 1. Good. Keep your hands raised. 3. Miss anyone? Thank you. By show of hands at 2. Okay. 3. Thank you. Thank you. 4. and 5. Okay. That's a pretty even distribution. So looks like something we might have to discuss here. Or okay. The next concept that I want to have a little discussion on, we still have 15 minutes because we've been taking questions throughout. I'm assuming it's okay. We don't leave a ton of time at the end for questions, but keep raising your hands, and if there's still a lot of questions, we can leave time for that.
No one's answering questions in the chat.
In the chat, do we have questions in the chat?
Oh, acquisitions.
So the question in the chat, it might be helpful to have a little more. I'm not sure when this came in. 4.4, very recently. Okay. So does this go back to acquisition units at all? I know that the ACSIG has discussed NDA agreements and how those are affected by the current Folio setup. I know Consortia is probably much bigger than that, but I think the idea of sharing agreement data is maybe the opposite of, well, yeah, it depends on the setup, but we're sharing organization data. In that case, I think it will depend on the setup. Tenants are definitely a way to separate data. And if you're in this type of system, if you're capturing sensitive information on organization records, it's definitely something we'll have to consider if we were to share any of those records, or it might affect your decision to want to share a local organization record. So it may depend on how you're using it. And if we have to capture sensitive data, then moving forward, we may need to consider how we're associating that with an organization record. In the case of agreements, one of the common use cases we've heard is, you may have NDAs regarding what you're able to discuss with other members as far as your agreements with a particular vendor, or your license information with a particular vendor. And that if you were in a single tenant system, you might use acquisition units moving forward to separate that or to protect that information. And that's entirely true, or that would still be entirely true. In a multi-tenant system like we're talking about, you may still have more than one library that lives on a single tenant. And it's still possible to use acquisition units within a tenant. Still an entirely viable thing to do in that situation where maybe you have a main library and a law library. And as a group, you are part of a consortium and you represent one member, but within your tenant, you might still use acquisition units. I hope that addresses that question. So having said a few things about agreement records, obviously agreement records can have agreement lines and can be related to other data that is generally local data. So the question here is, do folks see it? I'll get rid of that. Yeah, sorry. Do you see value in sharing agreement data? Not necessarily agreement line data. Sorry, love it. Kick us off.
In a consortium setting, you can share any sort of shared purchasing, right? They offer the option for us acting as a search meeting and joining library out after the search meeting. It's one negotiated license, the same type of list. It's the same term, just that it's in January 1, using there. I can see that being shared.
We just have a budget.
Yeah, but it would be, and this is going beyond the scope of convention, we're talking about like, obviously, at least in the e-holdings setting, there are 20 H lines attached to that. So if there's an ability to, this is in the agreement one there, so when you think about it, how are you going to attach those agreement ones, the one agreements for points that you.
And it's kind of interesting. It's kind of an interesting concept because if you're sharing the agreement, like at the agreement level, and it's a shared thing that appears in all, it doesn't mean you have an agreement line in each member. If it were treated that way.
Right.
So in theory, yeah, it's maybe requires more knowledge than I have actually of agreements, but sorry.
If there's a central agreement, let's say MOBIUS, and then it's local or the word you derive, the same term, derive to 20 institutions that have it in their local they was the perfect exact thing. For particular, they would have one agreement, and then the local agreement line, would be in that instance, and then it wouldn't be all in one, right? Is that a different way to think of it in the appropriating, right?
Yeah. So I don't know if we want to get too far into this, but it's maybe an interesting clarification for shared instances as well. Just because an instance is shared doesn't mean there's a copy. Right. What's the best way to say that? It appears in the search index. So you'd be able to find it from any tenant. But a representation of that instance with a unique identifier that it matches the one in the central tenant is only created when you add holdings and items. So for an agreement, theoretically, you're not necessarily, if you're only creating an agreement for 20 libraries, and the thing that represents what's important to each member library is the agreement line, the agreement could be shared. And yeah, the idea of it being searchable and discoverable by every member library could be problematic. But the ability to attach the local data might work in that scenario. So I think, yeah. The interesting thing is there's already enough nuance here that, it's clear that it's a different use case than an instance record. So again, maybe something we really need to explore. And with the last couple minutes I have, thinking about having the possibility of sharing agreement data across all tenants, maybe we can get a show of hands how much of an impact you think this would have, this functionality. And then we'll let you all be free. So by show of hands, the ability to share agreement data at some level, thinking that it has very little impact, closer to the 1. Is there anybody who would say this is a 1? That's 1 for 1. Going once. A 2. 3. 2 for 3? 3 for 3? 2 for 3? Anyone say a 4? How about a 5 then? Five for 5. Well, on that bombshell, we're going to pretty much stop here. We've only got a few minutes left here. I don't think we'll get through another topic. So maybe we'll take a few more questions if there are questions. And if not, we'll just say thanks very much for listening. Thank you for participating online. Hope we addressed your questions. Take one more look here. And I hope you all have a great day tomorrow. Well,